I'm Venetia Rainey.
And I'm Arthur Scott Geddes.
And this is Battlelines, Global Health Security. It's Wednesday, 26th of November, 2025.
With conflicts raging around the world, aid budgets are being slashed in favour of defence spending. But experts are sounding the alarm.
They say that cutting aid might not just hurt people in the world's most vulnerable regions, but could also make life here in Britain more dangerous.
This week, Lord Dannatt, the former head of the British Army, will explain why cutting aid to boost defence may actually be making us less safe.
Plus, we'll hear from the author of a report by Chatham House on how China is filling the power gap and how it's impacting global health.
If we cut aid spending down to those levels, we're withdrawing an investment in our own security.
A soldier for 40 years, Lord Richard Dannatt served as the Chief of the General Staff of the British Army between 2006 and 2009. This week, he wrote in The Telegraph arguing that Britain needs to invest more in security overseas.
Lord Dannatt, welcome to Battlelines Global Health Security. You've written that history shows that targeted aid reduces the burden on the military. You're often referred to as the soldier's soldier. Do you think our troops are less safe now than they were before Labour cut the aid budget earlier this year?
Yes, there is no doubt that the UK's influence in the world comes through a combination of our hard power and our soft power. There's been much discussion about whether we're spending enough on defence. I would say we're not. So therefore, I'm not at all convinced that our hard power is as strong as it should be. But when we have integrated defence, diplomacy and development money together, that combines our hard power with our soft power, we can bring great influence to the world. And we've done that. I mean, when in the coalition government's time, probably largely through the pressure of the Liberal Democrats onto David Cameron, we put our development budget up to 0.7% of GDP. That was a huge amount of money that was being spent and being spent very well around the world. And now we've cut that to 0.3% in two cuts over the last few years. And if we take Nigel Farage at his word, if he should become Prime Minister, he wants to take it down to peanuts, down to 0.1%. Frankly, we would have lost a lot of our influence in the world through the erosion of our ability to help people in their own home areas. And the downside of that is, of course, we see more people coming to this country. It's a strong pull to come to this country. They come across in small boats. Some lose their lives. And we have all the issues of migration, illegal migration, which we're having to contend with. So spending a sensible amount, a good amount on our development budget actually has a lot of upstream long-term benefit.
Wrote a quite excoriating piece for The Telegraph this week. Britain must invest in security abroad or we risk further Sudans. You outline how the UK has really let Sudan down and, by extension, itself and the West in terms of our security. Can you explain that point?
The UK has had a lot of interest in Sudan over many, many years. We are the penholder, as it were, at the United Nations for trying to take forward a settlement in Sudan. And if you look at the number of people from Sudan who have come to this country in small boats, it is a considerable number. And it's just another example of our failure to use our diplomatic power, our development power, and at times our defence capability to help people in their own countries, prevent them becoming migrants to elsewhere, and prevent and at least reduce some of the pressure on our own populations here as a result of illegal, and in many people's eyes, unwanted additional migration.
Over the course of your career, are there any examples you can think of where you've seen defence spending and aid spending working very well together?
When I was Commander of British Forces in Bosnia in the mid-1990s, for the want of a small amount of money which we could spend in a development sense, we could have done so much more good for the Serb, Croat and Muslim communities that we were trying to bring together in late 1995 when the Dayton Peace Agreement was signed. Hard power, having tanks, having artillery, that has its role in certain times. But just being able to spend some money on restoring roads, restoring schools, restoring infrastructure, relatively small amounts of money can have a tremendous effect on the societies and the communities within which we're trying to operate. And it's been depressing at times when our government, in contrast to the American government, who by and large get it, where our government over the years has not. Political parties of both sides, of all sides, have failed to grasp this. Spending a certain amount of money on community action to increase and improve infrastructure and services to local people can really buy the hearts and minds of those people towards the support for the objective that you're trying to fulfill.
I'm wondering if you feel similar things about Afghanistan. You were commander of the British Army while we were going into that country. Obviously, the Taliban has since retaken it after a very chaotic withdrawal by the US and the UK. Did we fail to sufficiently deploy aid and development funding to win over hearts and minds to make good on the sacrifices made by Western troops?
When, in August 2021, the international forces, largely led by the Americans at the behest of President Biden, but following through a plan that first-term President Trump had agreed with the Taliban, we left unnecessarily early. There were only about 2,500 international troops in Afghanistan at the time, and we weren't involved in combat operations at that moment. But what we were doing was supporting and continuing to monitor and train and boost the confidence of the Afghan National Security Forces, and they were holding the Taliban at bay. Meanwhile, Afghan civil society was growing and improving at the time. At the time we left, there were over 300 female judges. Now, why does that really matter? But the fact, under the Taliban all those years before, there were no female judges. There are no female judges now. And I'm not using the number of female judges as a thermometer for how well a society is doing, but it's a comment on how we had helped improve that society. Girls being educated to secondary and tertiary levels, getting into professional occupations like the judiciary. We were doing a good job, and to have left prematurely in the shambolic way that we did in 2021, just to meet a commitment given wrongly, to save some money, to try and end a war, undermined the extraordinary good work that had been done over 20 years when the international forces first went in there as a reaction to sweep out Al-Qaeda and Taliban after 9/11.
How concerned are you that Russia, China, bad state actors like this will fill the vacuum being left by the decrease in aid spending by Western powers?
If you and I were to go to Africa today, we'd find somewhere between 900,000 and 1 million Chinese workers working in Africa. China has had an agenda for many years to want to take over Africa, a poor continent, but a very rich continent. And they're very clever in focusing where their work is going. They know that in the face of us not pulling our weight from a development point of view, they've got the market wide open. They've got an open goal to kick balls into. And they've been doing that in Africa. They're doing it in other parts of the world. Influence matters. Economic development matters. It all brings power and it brings further influence. And we're seeing a shift in the world as a result of particularly China, and to an extent Russia as well. But China is the major player in the relationship between China and Russia, really taking advantage of our, you could say, embarrassment of being a post-colonial power, not wanting to be too involved. But actually we're ceding too much influence, too much development potential, too much wealth in the world by being parsimonious and being hesitant. Not good.
What would you advise the government to make in terms of the best argument to convince the public that aid spending is a good use of money to keep us safe here in the UK?
Well, I think the wider case has to be made that on the one hand, we face quite a major security threat, or major threat to our own security in this country from an obvious threat like Vladimir Putin's Russia. But I think then to go on to make a slightly more sophisticated case that by investing in countries that are fragile, investing in countries where democracy is weak, investing in countries where, for the want of some inward investment, their people can live a better life, they would be more likely to want to stay in their own homes, bring up the children in the surroundings that they've grown up in, and not feel that they've got to become economic migrants and move to another country, and therefore want to come here. I mean, we, United Kingdom, I think probably as a part of our post-colonial experience, we've been very open to allow people from other countries to come here, particularly from the subcontinent and from parts of Africa where we were the colonial power. But, we don't need to do that ongoing. And that's why making the case for a decent amount of inward investment to those countries so that those countries can thrive and prosper and the people will feel that they've got a good life there, that's a much better thing for them and for the British people.
In your piece for The Telegraph, you describe a sort of sense of complacency around this threat, and you write that every pound we cut from development aid today risks costing us more in future military operations. Do you think we will come to regret reducing aid spending in the way that we have?
Well, I hope we don't, but if we continue on the trajectory that we are, and some of our potential political leaders of the future seem to suggest that they want to go, I think we will be brewing up greater problems for ourselves than we otherwise need to deal with. And therefore, I think arriving at a relatively modest and sensible level of about 0.5 or even back to 0.7, which was the figure we were spending on development aid a few years ago, is a very reasonable amount of money to spend to help people in their own countries, to secure their futures in their own countries, and reduce the amount of migration which we are seeing and experiencing and having difficulty with coming into European countries, and particularly into the United Kingdom.
Lord Dannatt, thank you very much for joining us on Battlelines Global Health Security. OK, well, let's dig a bit more into the details of those aid cuts, what's driving them, and also what impact they're having on global health. We're joined by the perfect person to talk us through that. Olivia O'Sullivan is the director of the UK in the World programme at Chatham House. Before joining Chatham House, she worked for over a decade in international development and foreign policy in the UK government. And you've just authored a new report, Rethinking UK Aid Policy in an Era of Global Funding Cuts, How the UK Can Respond to Emerging Security and Geopolitical Risks. Olivia, welcome to Battlelines Global Health Security.
Thank you.
2025 has really been a monumental year for aid budgets, hasn't it? Everything has shifted. In the report, you call it the sharpest contraction in decades. And you say that between 2023 and 2026, the 17 largest donors expected to cut more than $60 billion in aid. How significant is this? Just give us the top line. Is this the end of the global aid system as we know it?
This is hugely significant. I mean, I think the end of the global aid system as we know it might be a bit strong, but I think that's one of the points that we wanted to get across in the report, that there will still be some funding and there will still be many important donor and UN agencies, but it's critical that the UK and other actors who've been big in global aid and development before have a bit of a plan for what is going to be a very significant shock. I mean, you quoted the big headline number in the next 3 years, more than $60 billion out of the system. That's a fall from about $213 billion, so about a third of what has previously been spent in 2023. That's being driven by cuts from France, Germany, the UK, other European donors. But of course, the big significant hit to the aid system is the decision by the Trump administration to almost completely shutter USAID in early 2025. The US has been pretty consistently the biggest donor, in some years a third of all aid spending by what's called the OECD DAC, basically the club of wealthy countries who tend to be aid donors, has been spent by the US. And they're big funders of things like global health, big funders of things like international organizations who do some of the critical things that we talk about in the report and really underpin that system. So I wouldn't quite go so far as to say the end, but this is a big shock and a big change.
As you say, it's been a year of confusion, particularly with US aid. And I know there was a lot of discussion right at the beginning of the year, we're just going to slash it all, but not all of those cuts have transpired, right? Are you able to break down a bit for us what remains out of US aid's projects and what has actually cut? Of what we know most recently. I know it's still a bit of a sort of moving target.
At the beginning of 2025, we had this executive order from the Trump administration, as you say, very dramatic language, shuttering USAID. Then we know that around 80% of foreign aid contracts that were existing at that time were cancelled. But there was also quite a lot of confusing messages from the Trump administration, including at one point Marco Rubio saying, oh, we will preserve life-saving programs. Now, obviously, the big question is then what does that mean? And we know from networks that we have, from research that we've done, that USAID officials themselves on the ground had no understanding of what that meant and whether that meant a given program was okay or not. So the overall picture is a massive reduction in US funding, actually not just to aid, but also to international organizations. Some of the other US funding channels that exist have cratered as well. And continued wrangling with Congress about how much will be left. But what is likely to be left is a much smaller agency with much less expertise, probably under the State Department. We can see the effects of that already. When there was an earthquake in Myanmar in March, usually we'd expect the US to be on the ground in 24, 48 hours. It took about 3 days for there to be a US team. And when those US officials arrived, there were reports that they were receiving emails saying they'd been laid off. So they were confused about whether they were still working or not. Meanwhile, China took the opportunity to offer a significant amount of aid to Myanmar and demonstrate that it had a presence there, right? So we can see It's not just the reduction, it's the confusion that is causing issues, and we can see that it's playing into these geopolitical rivalries for sure.
International development once played a central role in British foreign policy. Until recently, the UK was one of the few countries to have consistently met the UN target of 0.7% spending. But our own spending has fallen quite dramatically as well. What do you think is driving that shift?
Yeah, it's a good question, because we can see the US political direction is much more ideological. There's a clear sense in the Trump administration that they are adversarial to the general idea of multilateral cooperation and international aid. That's not how I would characterise this UK government. I don't think that's what's driving them. I think if you look at European donors, including the UK, Europe is undergoing a shock right now, a slow-moving shock, but a serious one, in which our principal security partner, the US, is increasingly becoming unreliable, and we have a threat on our border and an ongoing conflict on our border. By our, I mean Europe's border. So we do, and I do agree personally, and Chatham House researchers have called for this many a time, we do need to spend more on defence. The issue is that our defence spending targets, alongside our fellow Europeans in NATO, will require us to spend billions more by 2035 if we're going to hit that 5% GDP target by that date. Tactically cutting the aid budget is very unlikely to fill even existing gaps in our current defence spending. The cuts that we made to the UK aid budget, it looks like will yield about £6 billion additional spending on defence by 2027 to 2028. But we're looking to hit around £73 billion defence spending by 2027, 2028 by that year, right? So what we are likely to need in European democracies is a bit of a reckoning with taxpayers, or a bit of a reflection on how we use fiscal rules. We need to have some honesty about how we hit those defence spending targets, and cutting what were comparatively small aid budgets just isn't going to get us there. And I would add, there are security consequences to cutting aid budgets in this way. So we maybe need to think a bit more broadly about the type of money we spend on our collective security, that I think is on a kind of spectrum between hard and soft power.
Well, that's what your paper argues, right? That there is this link between aid and security, and that it doesn't make sense to be cutting one to boost the other because they're inextricably interlinked, and that actually that $6 billion that you save from aid does a lot of very hard work in preventing conflict that you might need. I'm just generating hypothetically here, double that amount to fight a war later, for example. Can you just unpack that link between aid and security that you outline in the report?
Aid, or aid and development, is this really broad umbrella term, and we actually ask a lot of our development spending on our development policy. One of the things that it does is, of course, straightforwardly save lives when it is funding things like health, like education, like basic emergency response and relief. But a vast amount of the aid that we spend also goes to international organisations that address what we would call global public goods, right? So things that all countries benefit from, but that no one country can capture or control. So that's things like monitoring infectious diseases, which of course don't respect borders, right? If we have an outbreak in a poorer country that struggles to manage its health system without support, that outbreak can travel and affect us. It's things like the World Health Organization's pandemic preparedness and monitoring functions, right? The World Health Organization is already reporting significant cuts and significant disruption to its work because of these global aid cuts. There's that bucket of things, the things that international institutions do that do actually benefit us all. I mean, we're talking the week after the COVID inquiry was published. We have very serious defence and security challenges. I'm not undermining them at all. But in the past few years, if we think about what has been the most costly and difficult episode for this country in terms of national security, it's been the pandemic, right? So if we have international institutions who are charged with monitoring outbreaks of infectious diseases that might later affect us, it's in our interest to ensure that they're functioning well, that they're not staggering on in the face of really significant cuts. One of the other big trends that we identify in the paper is this likelihood that given these wider cuts, it will be countries that are most affected by conflict, most fragile, that probably lose out. It's easier to spend a mix of public-private funding in more stable countries. So it tends to be countries that are poor but not necessarily affected by conflict that benefit from that type of funding. More aid spending is now also spent on climate mitigation. Again, it tends to be easier to invest in the things you need to do that energy systems, infrastructure in countries that are basically stable, even if they're less developed. So you see around sort of 35 to 40 countries in the world that are really consistently affected by conflict, already kind of losing out from patterns in aid spending. If we're now slashing the amount that we're spending on aid, those countries are likely to lose out even more. And we should add that actually there's other US policy choices that have caused big problems, because some of those Trump tariffs have fallen on some of the poorest countries in the world as well. So there's a kind of double blow that is hitting the sort of group of countries that are most affected by poverty and most affected by conflict. And in the long run, if conflicts escalate, they tend to spill over, they tend to cause regional crises, they tend to be fertile ground for things like illicit finance, organised crime, and they tend to cause refugee flows. And we know that that's likely to rebound on us in the medium to long term.
Are there particular regions or conflicts that you're especially worried about?
We did a range of interviews for this report, and a lot of people flagged their concerns about Sudan as a conflict where, the UK does spend bilateral aid in Sudan. The UK has attempted to provide some diplomatic leadership in that crisis, but we know from public reporting that the UK has been less ambitious than it might have been about trying to control the outbreak of that conflict, which is escalating. We can see it getting worse. A few others that I think are worth being aware of is that whole region around the Sahel, where there's been a lot of disorder, a lot of conflict, a lot of coups, places like Haiti. Ukraine and the Middle East, in a way, they're so geopolitically fraught that they generate a lot of attention from kind of major powers, from the US in particular, for better or worse. It's in a way these second-order conflicts, and I'm not saying second-order in the sense that they're less important, but second-order in the sense that they generate less of that kind of geopolitical competition and attention, that kind of lose out, because it's often those sorts of crises where you would get the UN stepping in, or the UN managing either emergency relief or trying to manage sort of containing the conflict or preventing conflict. And it will be very difficult for an international system, for international institutions that have lost out on a lot of funding, to continue to do that as effectively as in the past.
One of the startling things from the report for me is that even within the downturn in aid spending, it seems that spending on health specifically has taken the hardest hit. And there's quite a staggering statistic, which is that the Health Institutions and Health Security Department, which is the part of the FCDO that kind of focuses on global health, I suppose, that's had a 61% cut to its budget. Why do you think it is that health seems to be bearing the brunt of these cuts?
So it's worth saying that if you look at it in the round, the UK has tried to maintain funding to some of the big global health funds, like the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB and malaria, like Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. I mean, the UK is giving less than it's previously said to some of those big institutions. But there clearly has been an effort to preserve some funding to global health. But it's some of the, I guess, smaller, more specialist institutions that are losing out. So you point out that statistic about the Health Institutions Department within the FCDO. Another thing that we pointed out is that the Fleming Fund, which was a big UK initiative to deal with antimicrobial resistance, right? This very much in the category of a global public good, a collective problem, antibiotic and antimicrobial resistance, the development of superbugs, right? The UK for a long time very much saw itself, because the US is a big global health funder, the UK often took on these slightly more specialist or specific issues. Antimicrobial resistance has pretty consistently been one. As a result of the UK's cuts, the Fleming Fund is being shuttered. Now, the government says that it will continue that work by continuing to partner with developing countries to improve their health systems. That's what the Fleming Fund does. It helps poorer countries that are not so able to manage all of the problems that can cause drug-resistant superbugs to develop. The UK government says it will try to continue that work by partnering with those governments, with those countries, but there hasn't really been a lot of public detail about how that will happen. I think this is a really emblematic example, because when you have sudden cuts in a system, anyone who's worked in a big organisation knows, often the first things that go are things that are long-term, strategic, preventative, because they're not immediate emergency headline-grabbing things. But those things can be really important, and losing them could be really considerable. drug resistance is a big problem that will affect us all, that could potentially, some studies suggest, affect millions of us if it gets out of control. So I think some of the things that the UK was doing that were arguably more niche in the sense that they weren't headline grabbing have sort of fallen by the wayside as a result of these cuts. But they do have, and they may well have, effects on our collective health security over time.
You know, a lot of aid money that we spend on goes to making sure that countries are doing routine vaccinations.
Yeah.
So you've got things like measles, which is now surging all around the world, as being an obvious example of how this is kind of already starting to kind of get going as we've taken our kind of a foot off the brake as it is.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of factors in that statistic that measles is surging, right? We're seeing all kinds of politics around vaccination, including in the US. So we're cautious in the report to say we can't necessarily attribute that to global aid cuts, but we should consider that given the fact that measles is surging, the fact that we've got plenty of infectious diseases to be worried about, now is not a good time to, as you say, take your foot off the gas on infectious disease monitoring and management. Again, these are things that don't necessarily immediately seem like security threats, but it doesn't take a lot of imagination to think if something like that gets out of control, that could significantly affect our stability and security.
You mentioned migration, and I wondered if we could drill into that a bit more, because I think it's such a clear argument for how aid makes us safer here in the UK, in the sense that it helps to stabilise what is a very toxic debate that is being picked up by all sides of the political spectrum. Why is it that aid funding can help reduce migration?
Well, I'm really glad you asked that question, because I think that link between what we do in terms of aid development and aid spending and migration is really critical to clarify. Sometimes you hear people linking higher aid spending with reduced migration in this very broad way. And we should be clear that evidence shows when poorer countries get a bit wealthier, you actually do often see increased migration, because people have the means to migrate, because they are able in a way to raise their aspirations, because things are a little bit stabler and wealthier at home. What I think is critical and significant is irregular migration, i.e. refugee flows, i.e. small boat arrivals in the UK into Europe, comes from countries which are mired in conflict. So where we tend to see countries that get wealthier produce more migrants, that tends to be more through regular governed channels. Where we tend to see asylum seekers, refugees, small boat arrivals, those people tend to come from countries that are mired in conflict very consistently over the past decades. The countries from which those people come tend to be places like Afghanistan, Eritrea, Iraq when it was mired in conflict, Syria when it was mired in conflict. And that's also where you see real kind of migrant shocks, in the sense that you get sudden flows and irregular flows and poorly governed flows of people. So that's where I think there's a real sort of question mark about what is the strategy of this government and actually of many Western countries when it comes to aid, because as I said earlier, trends in aid spending do mean that a consequence of these cuts might well be that it's particularly conflict-affected countries that lose out. And it's particularly those situations that tend to generate the sorts of shocks that mean people flee. I think it's also worth saying that we should think about some of the countries who are wealthier and more stable, but that neighbour countries mired in conflict, because it's actually many of those countries who host huge numbers of refugees. So Kenya hosts huge numbers of Somali refugees. Bangladesh is hosting around 1 million Rohingya refugees, still following the crisis in 2017, that started in 2017, 2018 in Myanmar. Right, so many of these countries are increasingly wealthier, increasingly important allies to the UK. Many UK strategies talks about how critical it is to build relationships with some of these countries in the global south that are becoming wealthier, becoming more influential. We should really think, if there's going to be a crisis, particularly in the UN, particularly in agencies like UNHCR that manage these big refugee camps that support these countries to host these people, there's potentially going to be a real loss of patience. And I think that could become a bigger bone of contention between some of those countries and Western donors than we're perhaps anticipating now, if they lose out on some of the humanitarian funding that has been able to maintain, basically, and help to run and help to manage those situations.
Labour has already cut the aid budget from 0.7 to 0.3%. The Tories want to cut it to 0.1%, and Reform, if my maths is right, want to cut it to 0.03%. What's the most powerful argument that this government can make to the public to preserve the aid budget from any further cuts?
If we cut aid spending down to those levels, we're withdrawing an investment in our own security. There are arguments for allocating money in different ways around the edges, but that level of reduction would mean we're no longer meeting our responsibilities as a global player in the sense of funding, paying our dues to institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, which after all have helped out the UK in the past too, right? These institutions don't just exist for the poorest countries in the world. We would no longer be funding the ability of the global system to respond to really serious emergencies that we know the UK public responds to because they give an awful lot when charity appeals are made in response to things like the earthquake in Myanmar, to things like the refugee crisis in Bangladesh. But we also would be withdrawing an investment in things like controlling infectious diseases, preparing for pandemics, in exactly the things that, when uncontrolled, threaten our security too. So I do think there is a case for being a bit clearer that quite a lot of aid spending is an investment in collective security and stability. We're in a pretty insecure and unstable world right now, and we know a lot of the UK public recognise that. We know that they find Trump in particular a worry, and they're concerned about what he and his administration have done to kind of undermine some of the institutions that ensure the world works in a relatively stable way. And we think it would be good for the UK to, even in a world of very difficult choices, have a bit more of a clear approach to maintaining that stability and working with other like-minded countries to maintain that stability.
That was Olivia O'Sullivan from Chatham House.
That's all for today's episode. We'll be back again next Wednesday. Until then, goodbye.
Goodbye.